Hello and welcome to the Terran Space Academy, where we help prepare you for a bright future in the space industry. This is rocket science, and today we're going to do something a little different. Today I'm going to talk to you about the space industry itself and my motivation for creating these lessons. As I'm sure you found, when you go and look at videos that are available to learn about space, they usually come in two varieties. One that's either so simplistic that it doesn't really teach you anything. It's basically a recap of whatever's been on the news. And the second is something that's so detailed and in-depth to a specific part of the space industry that you really can't see the overall picture. When I started studying space, originally, was back in the United States Air Force. Now, I had served in the United States Marine Corps so that I could get my bachelor's degree. I came from a pretty rural area, and there were a lot of kids in my family. So to go to college, I needed some help. So the United States Marine Corps provided that, and I got a bachelor's degree in computer science and an associate's degree in business management, and then became an officer in the Air Force. And the Air Force had said, if you will go into ICBM command, we will pay 100% of whatever education you want. Now, I needed prerequisites for medical school, and they said they also had scholarships for medical school. So I became a Minuteman II ICBM commander and continued my studies so that I could fulfill my dream of being a doctor. Because growing up in very rural, I was born in Kansas, but grew up in rural Arkansas. There was not a lot to do out there, and we watched television where we could. You know, we got 3 channels back then. You had to change the position of the antenna. But the original Star Trek made me fascinated with science, medicine, and military command. And so from a very early age, I started reading every science book I could find. Before I could pronounce the word astronomy, I was reading astronomy books and went through all the science books in our little town. And as I studied these things, I wished that lessons were a little more interesting and that they gave you a good overall picture before going into the details that could be mind-numbing. And so later, I was in the Air Force. I was about halfway through a degree in aerospace engineering when I finished all my prerequisites and got accepted into a very good medical school. So I went to that school. And I graduated with my medical degree, and I practiced medicine, military medicine, and all that. And then when I was working in the ER at one point, I felt like I needed to go back and go ahead and finish my space science degree because I really loved space science and I wanted to do more in that field. So I went back and finished a master's degree in space science. Now, the difference between a space scientist and an aerospace engineer is that the scientist dreams something up, studies stuff, clarifies, does all that, does research, where the engineer builds stuff. So an aerospace engineer will know how to apply the rocket equation that we're always talking about, but he might not know everything about where it came from or how it was developed and all that. And just for educational purposes, the rocket equation was developed by a self-taught teacher who grew up in rural Russia and just loved the idea of space. So Tsiolkovsky developed the rocket equation, and we use it all the time on these lessons. And some of you have asked about the 35-engine Raptor 3s that are going to go into the new Starship. 280 tons of force. And someone complained that I used MT instead of T for tons, but I really wish they had just said megagram instead of tons for 1,000 kilograms. So I try to use metric as much as possible because that is what the space industry should be using. Using any standard numbers increases the risk of someone making an error like we did when we lost one of our Mars exploring landers, because it crashed into the Martian surface because they didn't convert from imperial to metric. So we try to use metric as much as possible. And at the same time, we'll use meganewtons or kilonewtons, But also sometimes I will convert that into pounds for my American friends to have some conversion in their head. But it's more important that we learn the metric than that we stick to something that only one nation on earth really does. So just because we've been the biggest and most technologically advanced nation since World War II is not an excuse to not improve and keep up with everyone else. So we use metric here, and you know, I wish again that they had called it megagrams instead of tons, but they didn't. So MT stands for metric tons, and I could just use T for tons, but it's spelled TONNES when it's metric, and a lot of people get confused by that. So I try to differentiate it. But if you had 35 Raptor 3s producing 280 tons of force, so you divide the newtons by 9.8 meters per second squared by the force of gravity, and you get tons of force. That's only works on Earth, right? When the gravity's not the same on the moon, so the newtons work everywhere. Tons of force really is only for the Earth, unless you remember to divide by the gravitational force of whatever body you happen to be on. So, but 280 tons of force, you multiply that by 35, and then I always say divide by 1.5 so that you can get the, so you've got the thrust, and then you use a 1.5 thrust to weight ratio to get your best launch mass. So a thrust to weight ratio of 1.5 is good. That's why we're always using it. So then you get your launch mass, and from there, depending on staging, it'll determine how much mass you can get to orbit. Now, staging is very important because as you drop it takes a lot of mass to hold the propellant, right, in that first stage, because the first stage is big because it's lifting the most mass. So if you look at the Saturn V, it had an RP-1 first stage. If you look at the Starship, it's using methane. But both the first stages are much bigger than the second stage. Now, the Saturn V had 3 stages, and the more stages you have, the better your percentage of mass to orbit will be, no matter what propellant you're using. And so the Saturn V had an RP-1 or kerosene first stage to produce a lot of thrust and get the thing off the ground. Then they used hydrogen second and third stages to get the thing on into orbit. And that was very, very effective. And a lot of people have thought that maybe SpaceX should have used hydrogen for their second stage. I think that for lunar exploration, there should be a hydrogen third stage. I think that they should take their 35 engine first stage. Remember, the outer 20 engines cannot restart. So they've got 35 engines with 20 on the outside, 10 inside that. And right now, 3 in the center. Later, it's going to be 5 in the center. But the 10 ring can restart, and so can the inner 5 or 3. And so if we have a 35 engine first stage and it takes off, you could take another booster. You could stack it, cut it in half, stack it on top, make that a second stage, and put, instead of the 35 engines, take off the outer 20 and just use 15 engines. Perfectly fine for a second stage, right? Maybe the second stage using hypersonic retropulsion, firing its engines as it came back in. Maybe it could push the shock waves back enough to be able to re-enter the atmosphere and survive. Who knows? Maybe not. Maybe it could survive coming in broadside with the heat tiles like the first stage is going to do. Like the Starship is going to do. The first stage doesn't go that fast. It's not reaching orbital velocity. It's not reaching 7,800 meters per second. So it doesn't have to have heat tiles on it to come back. But you'll notice that the SpaceX Falcon 9 first stage, it does fire its engines to push the shockwave back and give it kind of a shield as it comes back in. And I think that would work for a Starship second stage. And then you could stack the Starship on top of that half booster second stage. And with those 35 engines, you could really get a lot of mass to orbit. It's insane if we do the math on it. And that's what I want you to do. Look at a 35 engine first stage. Look at a 15 engine second stage. And then the Starship itself has 6 engines right now. They're talking about making that 9. If they put 5 in the middle and then 3 around that, that would be 8. But anyway, people are saying 9. We'll see how that goes. and see how much they could get to the moon. Now, also, the third stage would probably be hydrogen powered and made out of carbon fiber and a lot lighter. So there are other ways. When you're talking about getting to the moon, you're not talking about coming back to Earth and re-entering and being reusable. So they should just not even, I think, not even worry about making Starship reusable right now. They should focus completely on getting us to the moon effectively. And a moon base would really, really help set up all kinds of new stuff. Lockheed Martin is talking about their moon base and everything, but no matter who is talking about what, until you have a transportation system that gets you there reliably and not too expensively, it's all a waste of time to discuss anything, because it's all just useless dreaming until we have a transportation system that makes it possible. So I sincerely hope that before Elon Musk gets himself in too much political trouble or other trouble with his Twitter thumbs and his mouth, that he completes the Starship system well enough that it will survive whatever might happen to him. It's usually not a good idea to draw down a whole bunch of political anger towards you. The politicians have enormous power. The justice system in America, we like to think that it's objective and whatever. It is not. When you come to their attention, if they don't like you, you will be destroyed. If they like you, you'll be fine. And right now, he's making a lot of enemies. Now, I understand that he was treated very, very badly, right? I remember that the White House had this big electric car company meeting, and they did not invite the only American electric car company that has been successful in the last half century. So Elon Musk created the electric car industry as we know it today after General Motors chopped up their electric cars. And you can watch the film Who Killed the Electric Car to learn all about that. And it's a good movie. So Elon did create the electric car industry, and he was completely ignored because he doesn't like unions and he's non-union. Well, if you want him to like unions, then maybe invite him to that. Give him a nice medal like you do Rush Limbaugh, so that he can know that Americans appreciate what he has done, and talk to him and discuss with him about whether or not unions are a good idea. It's interesting, but unions are extremely vital to keep people from being abused by companies. But once people are not being abused by companies, then the unions sometimes become powers unto themselves and start living for their own sort of purposes, and they forget about what they're there for. They get involved with organized crime or organized political manipulation, whatever, and it becomes a bad thing. If we had no unions, that's terrible. If unions have absolute control, that's terrible. Somewhere in the middle is probably nice. I know some people don't like it at all, and people will get mad when I express any political opinions. That's tough. The entire purpose of this channel is to try to influence the next generation of space scientists so that my grandchildren's generation can live on the moon, on Mars, wherever they want to, and so that no political ideology that gains mastery over the Earth will be able to control and suppress everything. Now let's talk about that for a little bit. The founders of this nation did not want a lot of federal control. They wanted the individual states to have control over most stuff, and the states police the people, and the federal government police the states. That has changed dramatically. And one of the reasons that I've had the time to create these lessons over these multiple years is because all this time, for the last 5 years, I have been fighting with the federal government over the practice of medicine. Who decides the practice of medicine? Is it your doctor, or is it some federal agent or attorney or politician with a badge that wants to come in and say, contrary to medical evidence and actual law and FDA and all that, who wants to say you can treat these people but not those? We don't like the way your patients look, or we don't like the way you're practicing medicine. The law is very clear on this. There's a law called 42 U.S.C. 1395, which says that the federal government or any employee thereof cannot even try to influence the practice of medicine or any practitioner thereof. And that has been completely ignored in the war on drugs. Now, I have another channel where I talk about this, and I will put a link to it at the end. And I've written a book about it. I do research in this area. So there are two things I do a lot of research on. Neuroscience as it relates to addiction and chronic pain and all that, and space. Because these are two areas that I think are critically not just undereducated in America, but miseducated, right? When I started studying space, all we talked about was the Apollo program. That's all we talked about. And now when it comes to medicine, everything is pretty much being dictated by the federal government. And if you don't comply, you don't practice. Okay? I see that as no different than the Soviet interference in medicine and the German interference in medicine during the Nazi regime. And I've written about that. Now, medical boards have the right to police the medical conduct, and that's fine. But the federal government does not. Right? And in their war on drugs, they have started to make it a war on patients and a war on physicians. And I write about that. I've had a lot of published articles, and part of my book is about it. And I want to let you know that over these years, as I've been fighting this, it has been tremendously comforting to me to be able to have the time to create these lessons. But one of the reasons I had this time is because of the fight I have with the federal government. And this isn't the first time I've fought them. This isn't the first time I've felt like they have acted unjustly. And I feel like it has reached a point to where we need options to go to. We need to be able to get away from people who want to control every aspect of our lives. And I won't say which side I think that is, because, you know, I want you to learn science from me. I want you to learn space science on this channel and neuroscience on my other channel. And no one is so smart that they can tell you how to think. I want to present the evidence to you and have you make up your own mind. Okay, that's the same when it comes to spiritual things. What I believe or what I think is immaterial. And I think that's where Elon Musk makes a big mistake when he thinks that because he has had success in one area, that he's brilliant in all of them. That he can talk about social things and he can talk about other things, and that he knows from a position of knowledge. And that's absolutely not true. In fact, I believe that he is becoming the bullies that used to torment him. He is becoming much more like the father that was very cruel to him. And that sometimes happens over time. We sometimes kind of gravitate back toward how we were raised. And that's unfortunate, because I've read his book. I'm very sympathetic to the problem he has, the Asperger's syndrome, that makes it hard for him to relate to people socially. But I think now that he's gotten rich and wealthy, he's in an echo chamber where people only support and speak about what they think he wants to hear. And that's not good. Your best friend is the one that smacks you and takes your keys away when you've had too much to drink and you're about to drive home. Your best friend is not the one that lets you get away with everything. So that's today's lesson. I want you to go ahead and calculate for a 35-engine first stage. I want you to use the rocket equation and figure out 35-engine first stage, 15-engine second stage, regular Starship on top. How much propellant could that intermediate stage, that second stage, carry and still get off the ground if you've got 35 Raptors at 280 tons force. And another thing was, I talked about the 350 seconds of specific impulse, and people said that's at sea level, that's not. Okay, understand that as you go up, as the atmosphere thins, your specific impulse improves, your efficiency improves, because you don't have the atmosphere pushing back on it. The actual rocket equation, it considers your starting velocity, and the equations that determine exhaust velocity, you have to subtract the outside pressure because it's pushing back, right? And so once you're about 10 kilometers up, and that was where they used to test the Starships at and drop them back down, The air is so thin that it has very little effect. Now, I always talk about aerospikes and how much I like them, but if you've got a 3-stage system, sea level engines on the first stage that are efficient up, and then the second and third stage can be vacuum engines, that's great. That'll work great. And they don't have to be, because 350 seconds of specific impulse in vacuum is amazing for a sea level engine. Okay, so if it starts at 330, recognize that very quickly it's up to 350 and that's changing. And that changes the values we get from our rocket equation. So to really measure these things, you would have to use a computer program to simulate the thickness of the atmosphere and how much it's interfering with the exhaust velocity, and you would have to do that whole calculation. But that's not what we're doing here, because this is, these are courses to give you a rough idea. So you can grab a piece of paper and you can crank out these equations from the basics and you can get a good idea. Now, when I come up with a solution for something like putting the robots in Starliner, that's not what I'm saying they should necessarily do, and it may not be what I would do if they gave me that job. It might be exactly what I would do, because I think that's a perfect use for humanoid robotics, is to test human-rated systems before humans are in them. But another purpose of this channel is to learn to think outside the box. If you can only do something manually, then do it remotely manually. Human beings had to rush into Fukushima and Chernobyl because they had to shovel things and move things. I don't want that anymore. I want robots to go running in there that are teleoperated, and I want them to handle the dangerous stuff. And I think that's a wonderful use for robots. It'll be a long time before AI gets there. So I will put a link to my other channel, and at the end now, I'm going to play a video from my other channel to give you some idea of what I've been dealing with while I've been making these lessons. And I appreciate you, and I appreciate your support on Patreon, because that is what has kept me going over these years. And it's extremely important and very much appreciated. And I hope that you've all learned something from these lessons. I can't guarantee that I will win this battle and that I will be here to keep speaking to you. If I am not, I have someone that I'm trying to talk into taking over. Wonderful man, also in the space industry. And I'll introduce you if that becomes necessary. But until then, stay safe at Astra Pro Terra. What is a legitimate medical reason to prescribe an opiate medication today, for pain or addiction? And who decides which patients are worthy of treatment? This question is not just of academic interest. Any prescribing medical provider today must constantly live in fear that a law enforcement agent somewhere will disagree with the prescriber's answer to these questions. On its face, it seems simple. If a patient has severe pain, a prescriber can treat that pain with medications approved for that purpose. The same for addiction. Simple, right? Not really. There is a fundamental disconnect between the way law enforcement sees people and the way good healthcare providers see them. In short, law enforcement hopes to find a reason to lock someone up. Making arrests gets them awards and promotions. It's what they do. They look at people as potential targets of prosecution. Physicians and healthcare providers, on the other hand, see these patients from a diametrically opposite perspective. In order to help them heal, we must see them as human beings. We must give them the benefit of the doubt. We must form a bond of trust. The forging of this bond is absolutely critical to successful medical care. As much as amazing advances in medical science have improved the lifespans of the average person, the belief that your doctor cares for you and is doing their best to help you is absolutely critical to the healing process. How many times have we seen a technically proficient physician become absolutely estranged from the patient as a person? No one feels like they have received proper medical treatment if they get the distinct impression that their doctor does not care. And nothing will preclude the formation of this bond more than physicians having to look at every patient as a suspect or a threat, not just to the doctor's practice, but to their very liberty. It is my absolute belief that not only should physicians see through a lens of humanity, but that we must. We know from history where doing otherwise leads. Physicians in East Germany and throughout the Soviet Union were co-opted by the state to diagnose dissident and divergent thought as a sign of mental illness and a threat to the community. Declaring a belief in free speech was enough to get you thrown into a dungeon-like asylum and treated with terrible procedures like insulin comas and hypothermia, until most had indeed lost their grip on reality. In China today, if you need an organ and have the money, a matching one will mysteriously quickly appear, and physicians that have escaped that regime tell us that a prisoner somewhere, a person with hopes and dreams and family, consequently disappears. We cannot allow our system to become more like theirs. We must not allow ourselves to be co-opted into the current political panic regarding pain and addiction treatment. We must not be forced to be arms of the federal or state government, looking at every patient through a lens of suspicion. We must be allowed to do what we believe is best for our patients, according to our education, training, and experience, not according to the prevailing political sentiment or the opinions of law enforcement. The war on drugs may have started off trying to protect Americans from the dangers of drug abuse. That statement is itself debatable, but it has clearly ended up destroying many fundamental principles of our nation through policies like civil forfeiture and mass incarceration. Does 5 grams of methamphetamine do more harm to someone's life than a mandatory 10 years in prison? Is the damage to a child's life when they lose meaningful contact with a parent or caregiver of no value at all? These questions can reasonably be argued from both sides, but what cannot be argued is that the physicians have an ethical and moral obligation to treat pain and suffering. The problem is that law enforcement has no such mandate. In fact, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Warren v. the District of Columbia, 1981, that police officers have no specific duty to protect individuals. They can stand around laughing while teenage girls drown in a flooded car, as they did in St. Petersburg, Florida in 2016, and not be prosecuted or even sued. Doctors and other medical professionals may clearly have a different set of ethical and moral obligations, but these obligations don't protect us from those who clearly do not. How do we get out of this morass? How do we extricate ourselves from the battlefield and start to rebuild? Sometimes I think that all physicians should refuse to treat pain or addiction until the dictates of Ruan are enshrined into federal law, precluding prosecution, and not just providing grounds to appeal. As anyone caught up in the American federal conviction system knows, the wheels of justice in America turn slowly and almost always in only one direction. There is no way to be made whole after you have been targeted. Everything in your life is attacked and destroyed. On the other hand, if we turn our backs on those suffering from pain and addiction to ensure our own safety, how are we any better than those physicians, now reviled by history, that participated, or just looked the other way, while human beings were treated as unworthy of the most basic medical care? I am encouraged by the example of the White Rose Committee founded in Germany in the 1940s, not because things went well for them, but because they tried. This group, started by one professor and 5 university students, opposed the abominable crimes their country was committing, including the forced sterilization and even murder of disabled patients and the mentally ill, some of them even being left to starve to death in their beds. The names of Willy Graf, Kurt Huber, Christoph Probst, Alexander Schmorl, Hans Scholl, and Sophie Scholl should be engraved at the entrance to every institute of higher education in America. All were eventually arrested. Hans, Sophie, and Christoph were executed by guillotine 4 days after their arrest, followed later by Alexander, Willy, and Professor Huber himself. I'm not saying that things are that dire here, at least not yet, but we are not on a good trajectory. I also want to mention Drs. Karl Brandt and Julius Hellervorden, a physician and psychiatrist respectively. They initially spoke out against the regime's medical mandates, but then decided to go along with the flow. Dr. Brandt went on to play a key role in implementing euthanasia and medical experiments on helpless prisoners, and Dr. Hallervorden did also. Brandt was tried at Nuremberg and hanged, but Hallervorden was not put on trial and continued his medical career until his death in 1965. I don't know if anyone asked the last two doctors if surviving a few extra years was worth the betrayal of everything a physician should stand for, but it is a question we must ask ourselves today. If we are convinced that our patient has severe chronic pain, do we not then have a legitimate medical reason to prescribe that patient a medication approved for that purpose? If we are convinced that our patient suffers from an addiction, can we not then treat them with medication and other therapies also approved for that purpose, without needing to listen for the boot against the door? I would argue that we have not just the right to do so, but an absolute obligation. I hope you would agree.